Gaat u zitten, please be seated. Ik open deze openbare vergadering van de promotiecommissie van de School of Business and Economics met het uitspreken van het votum. Onze hulp is in de naam des Heren die hemel en aarde gemaakt heeft. Before asking, we now turn to English. Before asking the first opponent to speak, I invite the candidate to give an overview of the research on which the thesis is based.
Rector, opponents, supervisors, family and friends. When I decided to pursue a PhD, I knew I wanted to explore board's decision-making. As I am a former Arthur Andersen employee, it was painful to watch how Arthur Andersen collapsed due to Enron and decisions that were made by board members. And I wondered, how come these smart board members have not been able to prevent these scandals, and even sometimes wind up in jail for their actions, like the CEO of Enron in the picture? Did they consciously do wrong, or did more or other factors come into play? Did silence their thoughts and feelings, and if so, why? Could silence explain these failures? Throughout this dissertation, I explored the main question, how does the unsaid shape decision-making in boards? And I answered this main question by exploring 4 different sub-questions in 4 different papers, and I will briefly present each of these papers now. In the first paper, I theorize how, when board members do not say what they mean and or assume not all is said, they risk eliciting a spiral of unsaid known. In this paper, I introduce a conceptual model, which I developed based on literature, and I introduce the construct unsaid known, which refers to the intuitive knowing that shapes an individual's response. But what does that mean? As people are able to think around 800 to 1400 words per minute, they are able to process a lot more words than they're physically able to express. How many words per minute do you think they can say? I learned that people can only express about 300 words max per minute, but in normal conversations, they express around 140 words per minute. Oh, sorry. Although we consciously tend to focus on what is said, we preconsciously listen to what is not said. Preconsciously means that people have forgotten about this skill, but when reflecting on it, they can explain what they felt and thought, but did not say, and why not. Through metacognitive skills, they've learned to preconsciously think about their own thinking, but also think about what others think and what they think others are thinking about their thinking. In a group like in the picture, this means that while people talk and other people listen, a lot happens unsaid. Interestingly, when what is said is not aligned with what is felt and thought, people tend to focus more on the unsaid than on the said. The relevance of the unsaid increases. Unfortunately, our metacognitive skills are not flawless. Our silent assessments and inferences can be biased or incorrect, but as long as they remain silent, they're not explored, neither refuted. I also theorize in this paper that boards are open systems. Board members continuously communicate with stake and shareholders, and therefore the unsaid between stakeholders and boards shape their decision-making processes as well. In the second paper, I introduced the term paradigm attachment. This construct which emerged from studying boards empirically. In a governance context where board members have to respond quickly and effortlessly, they respond based on a set of connected implicit assumptions or governance paradigm. Board members are governance paradigm attached when they perceive their assumptions on the governance task objective and true. A governance paradigm conflict then emerges when board members silently and unknowingly have different expectations about the governance task and start judging each other's performance when they consider their paradigm true or objective. So picture this situation as an example. One non-executive with a specific governance paradigm is not happy with how something is being managed by the CEO and politely tries to address his concern through posing a question. This CEO with another paradigm senses the non-executive is not happy, also does not understand the feedback, but responds politely by answering the question. The non-executive is not satisfied with his response because he feels not all is said and starts feeling even more concerned. So he poses an additional question. The CEO gets irritated because she feels not appreciated, but repeats her answers. And in this case, then, the chair steps in and suggests to move on as he feels the CEO has sufficiently answered the question. The bystanders, or other non-executive and executives who have noticed that tension was building up, assess the performance of the CEO, the chair, and the non-executive differently or similarly, depending on their paradigm, and moreover have similar or different expectations on how this tension should be handled by whom. How and if this conflict is reconciled depends on what happens in and or after the meeting and who discusses what with whom, formally and or informally. When this situation is not managed effectively, a cool situation can grow into a pseudo-cool or even hot conflict. When the board member with the minority paradigm is ostracized and or when he or she leaves the board, the conflict is managed, but the underlying paradigm conflict about the governance task and blind spots about own and other performances has not surfaced, let alone reconciled. In the third paper, the sub-question how silence climates shape decision-making in the boardroom is explored. In this paper, I theorize that 4 distinct silence climates shape how board members manage the conflict between, on the one hand, cohesiveness and, on the other hand, cognitive conflict. And I have plotted these 2 criteria and 4 climates in the quadrant, which is shown on the slide. A compliance climate, for example, has a high level of cohesiveness, but low level of cognitive conflict when board members silently agree that they should silence their opinion when the topic which is of concern is not of their responsibility. A conflict climate, on the contrary, has a low level of cohesiveness when, due to a cognitive conflict, board members enact relationship conflicts. In the last paper, I justify how I studied the unsaid in the boardroom and reflected upon my research. First, I observed and tape recorded 36 meetings of 17 boards. These observations allowed me to understand the specific context, routine, and language of the board. After the meeting, I interviewed all 119 board members who were present during the board meeting, which I observed, and we analyzed in action what was not said and why not. While analyzing and comparing the data, I simultaneously also shared my emerging theories during presentations and explored to what extent these theories resonated with these attending board members. In addition, I reflected upon what I thought when I thought the unsaid emerged during the research and how my biases and incongruities could have shaped my findings. Reflecting upon my approach, I also theorize in this paper that it's important to distinguish between types of unsaid. Moreover, I explain that through perspective taking, the unsaid can be brought into consciousness. Silent judgments, on the contrary, suppress the sharing of the unsaid. Concluding, what do these findings imply? As board members pre-consciously decide what to say and not to say, when, to whom, and why, they do not always intentionally silence what they think and feel. They operate in this highly taken for granted way due to a combination of limited time, complex issues, and high expectations of stakeholders. Only when they experience a conflict, they start consciously deciding if or how to speak up and face many serious voice dilemmas. Speaking up is therefore not just a matter of courage, but of real risk. As governance codes and conventions do not explain how and when to voice and handle these conflicts, they nurture the conflict when board members have a conflict on how these conflicts should be managed.
Thank you. I would like to ask the candidate whether she is ready to defend her thesis.
Rector, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans and in accordance with the Doctoral Examination Committee in the School of Business and Economics, I'm prepared to defend my thesis entitled How the Unsaid Shapes Decision-Making in Boards in order to obtain the degree of Doctor of Philosophy.
The first opponent is Professor Mette Winter-Lassen, Professor of Communication and Organization at Aalborg University in Denmark. Professor Lassen, we are very pleased that you can join us today electronically, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying thank you very much for the opening presentation. And I want to express my gratitude for being invited into this committee and for being able to write this inspiring and thought-provoking and very independent piece of work that's both substantial and extends the frontiers of knowledge within the field. I enjoyed reading your thesis. I've learned something new and gained insight to a field that I believe is worthwhile researching more fully. And I look forward to today's defense. I am very impressed by the way you've been able to balance and create an intimacy with the board members you've been in conversation with and handle this intimacy in a way where you also present insightful data on issues that are quite sensitive and still manage to do this in an ethical and respectful way. This is not an easy balance, and I'm sure you put a lot of effort into this process. What you write resonates very well, and I'm happy to be able to express that in words and not only leave it as unsaid thoughts. So on the authority of the Rector Magnifius and the virtue of my right, I will now pose my first question to you. In the follow-up interviews you've had with the board members, you asked them whether the emerging theories resonated with them. I am curious as to what kind of knowledge you and the board members generated during these interviews, what kind of reflexivity emerged, and how did they perceive themselves and the relationships with other board members based on these interviews, and what role did you play? Thank you.
Dear learned opponent, thank you for your kind words and question. If I understand the question correctly, you're asking what I learned in the interviews when I knew whether it resonated, and so how we, I think, in action developed the theories together. Is that a correct way of rephrasing it?
Yes, and also curious as to your own reflexivity as you put a lot of effort into trying to unbias your data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I did was prepare these board members with 4 questions. I was asking them to reflect upon the question, what were you thinking and feeling, but not saying during the meeting? What kept you from saying it? And what do you think others were thinking and feeling, but not saying? And what do you think kept them from saying it? When I opened the interviews, I always asked them to ask questions, just an open structure. I did not structure the interview because I felt, you know, this is very grateful if they want to share something. So first sets some stage for trust, I would say. And so every interview was really different. Some people came totally prepared with detailed information. Others said, I haven't thought about it. You need to help me. So I worked with that. Some asked very much, a lot of questions before they at least wanted to say something. So I always try to comply to these needs, unsaid needs, I would say. And then a conversation more like emerged because you know, they sometimes said only after 30 minutes they expressed something very private because they had to have been testing whether I was transparent, I think, or whether I was perceived ethical maybe, and so they were testing me, and sometimes they didn't need that, but sometimes it was very obvious that they, for example, before they started expressing private information, they were going back to the rules of the game. How do we trust you? What are the rules regarding confidentiality? What are you going to do with the data? And then only after 30 minutes sometimes people really came with very interesting, well, sensitive information, well, that was of course great because that helped me develop my theories. But yeah, I could talk over an hour or hours to express what all happened, because sometimes also I felt that was also a question, how did I work with some difficult moments that I had. Once I was attacked, I think, unsaid by a board member. And I was really thinking, should I now say that I feel attacked, or should I work through this process just by answering the questions and trying to build trust, just by being really open to why would this person be attacking me? So that's a split-second decision that you're making. And these moments sometimes worked, sometimes did not, because some meetings I was not able to express. In this case, the person felt that I think I was open to this attack implicitly, was respectful in a way, and then it worked. In other sessions, I was not always able to express my unsaid, and then I worked through the interview knowing that you get so many perspectives on the same meeting that it doesn't really matter. So it doesn't matter if you get every piece of the puzzle, because you already get so many pieces of the puzzle that you can work with that.
Yeah.
Is this enough answer to your question?
I have a brief follow-up question, also because the first picture you started your presentation with, you showed a man in handcuffs, and you asked the question, how come these smart people make decisions that are not good for these boards and the companies? And so I get a sense that what you wanted to get out of these interviews was also actually to support them in being more reflexive about the role that they played in these board meetings. Is that correct?
Well,
Can you give a brief
answer? A brief answer, yes, of course. I did not have a purpose. I just wanted to explore. I didn't want to make them reflexive. I really wanted to understand what was going on, and not having like an action research approach wanting to help anything, or I didn't have an additional purpose.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
My husband is satisfied.
Yes, I am satisfied.
I noticed. The next opponent is Professor Ivo de Loo, Professor of Accounting at Nyenrode Business University. Professor de Loo, the same goes for you. Thank you for being here through Zoom or whatever, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I'm also very glad to be able to participate in this defense today. I really like it when researchers, whether they're PhD researchers or not, are daring enough to pick up a subject matter that is often left underexplored, whether it's the dark side of organizations or, in your case, the unsaid. So that already made me very happy. On top of that, I also realized that we share a love for the writings of Anne Cunliffe. And given that we share that love, I decided to frame my questions mainly around the research methodology, or perhaps I should say research methodologies that you adhere to in your thesis. So, on the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I would like to ask you the following questions. First of all, I seem to notice, but you may disagree on that, that there is a shift in terminology use when it comes to the description of your research paradigm. I'm not alluding to the notion of paradigm that you stick to in your thesis. I'm sticking to the notion of a research paradigm, that loosely coupled system of ontology, epistemology, and methodology. On the one hand, depending on where I am in your thesis, I see expressions such as concept, theory generation, abduction, triangulation, biases and debiasing processes. That's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, in different parts of the thesis, I see expressions such as constructs, intersubjectivity, subjectivity, reflexivity, etc. And given that I think, but as stated, you may disagree on that, given that I think that these expressions are not necessarily easily compatible, I conjecture that there is a shift in paradigm in the thesis as you go through the various empirical chapters. I wonder how you reflect on that. That's the first part of my question. The second part is, given where you think you stand in terms of your currently favorite research paradigm, how would you like a researcher to explore your unsaid? Because it's one thing to explore the unsaid in boardrooms. There is also such a thing as the unsaid in research. Things you don't talk about, things you don't write up. And yes, on the one hand, you could say I engaged in reflective processes. I formulated a number of questions. And by answering these questions, I try to highlight my involvement in the Research Act. But is that all there is to it, the it being your unsaid? That is my question. So on the one hand, is there a shift in paradigm in your thesis? Where do you stand now? That's the first part of the question. And given where you stand, how would you suggest a researcher to approach your unsaid? Thank you.
Learned opponent, thank you for your kind words also and your interesting questions. Regarding the first question about whether my ontology, epistemology may be shifted throughout the whole research process, I think you have, if looking back, I think I had a positivistic approach. I knew I wanted to study it interpretatively and qualitatively, but I am an economics student from, you know, when I studied when I was 20, and you enter the world of the practice. And I always felt like if you want to pursue a PhD, you have to prove things, you have to justify things, you have to test things. So in the first year when we studied methodologies, I was coding and I was trying to prove things. But I noticed that it didn't work for the purpose that I tried to achieve. And I think what the process I went through was actually gaining confidence that what I did was okay. And then while gaining this confidence, also gaining the literal language that is acquired, that is required to be consistent with, I think, my ontology and epistemological perspective, which is really difficult. So scholars have helped me by feedback, by stating, for example, you use a word like validation here, where you have a different, you use a subjective approach. How does that relate? And I've noticed still that I sometimes use words like validation in my script, so that I still have to work on my language, which does not always convey my perspective on how I should do, how I should study this. Now, for now, I think the best way to express how I consider my perspective is I think I'm an intersubjective, have an intersubjective ontology, but from that stance, I try to subjectively develop patterns, theories, or methodologies, concepts by adding critically reflexive elements. So although I have a subjective approach, I try to mitigate that by being very conscious, and I'm still learning to do that, because that's something I think I need to acquire more and more. But that is how I look at my own perspective now. Regarding the second question, how would I like research to explore the unsaid? I think the first thing is just to understand how complex it is and how we need the unsaid, and not to have some value system that is bad to have unsaid, or unsaid is always relating risks, or it's always this or that. It's far more nuanced. So before you study it, understand the construct, and then choose your topic consciously, and also it should be aligned with your ontology and epistemology. So if you want to approach it from a positivistic perspective, do so, but do it reflexively, consciously, and being consistent about it. what I find interesting is that if people study their topic from a positivistic stance, they often do not have to explain their ontology and epistemology by the journals that not all the editors ask for a justification for their approach. But if you study things as topic from an interpretative way, then you're challenged and you have to convey a consistent ontology. That's what I learned at least.
This will do.
This will do? Yes.
Yeah, this will do.
Sorry, I can go on.
Because I noticed that the opponent is satisfied. Because, yeah, we have 6 opponents. And,
yes, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. You can talk for an hour, I noticed.
Yes.
I now give the floor to Professor Rens van Loon, Professor of Dialogical Leadership at Tilburg University. Professor van Loon, we are very pleased with your presence and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Is my mic on?
Yes.
On the authority of Director Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I first of all would like to compliment you with the work you did. When you have been in a boardroom, you sense that things are said and things leave unsaid. And it's what all my predecessors already said, it's courage to explore that. It's also difficult. And my questions hopefully help you to formulate it a little bit sharper. And I would like to connect with the question that the Professor Delot asked you. And that's about the ontological status of the unsaid. I really appreciated reading your work. But if you think about what is the ontological status of the unsaid, you use the word ontological and epistemological, and I like these words very much when you are in a situation that you want to explore something. I've been in boardrooms many times. So I am a professor, but I'm also working with clients and I'm working in boardrooms. You say, for instance, that the unsaid is an individual level concept describing how individuals unilaterally and thus silently judge each other performance. I think that's right. You write also, the unsaid is a highly dynamic and intersubjective construct since individuals decide what to say, what not to say in the moment based on what is said and previously not said. So the first one, so like the unsaid is something in me, and the second sentence, it's on one of the pages, 24, is more relational. This confuses me, as you might understand. How do these relate to one another? As a researcher, you asked the question how you empirically explore the unsaid, and it is unclear what is exactly the unsaid. From an ontological point of view, the unsaid is not until you express the unsaid in relation to other people. Then it is. It is not, and then in relation it is. So in relation externally, it exists. If you do not express the unsaid, it does not come into existence. It does not exist. So while reading your research, one gets the impression that the unsaid has an ontological status. In my view, this is not correct. Are you aware of the risk of what I call substantializing a phenomenon, the phenomenon of the unsaid? Can you reflect on this, please?
Learned opponent, thank you for your compliment and interesting question. I think you want to reflect with me on what is the status of the construct unsaid and whether it's, when is it actually real, when it's there, maybe. I don't know how to frame it, but I've been struggling with that question. And I hope in paper 4, how do I research the unsaid, I've tried to answer that question by introducing those 4 levels of unsaid. Because for me, the unsaid known is, I would say, more relational construct. because then people respond in the moment, and it's very difficult to really pinpoint what's whose, because it goes rapidly. We respond preconsciously. We do not know why we do that in the moment. The moment when you start reflecting upon it, whether it's individual while driving your car, or when you're expressing it to a researcher or with colleagues, then it comes into existence, the unsaid. Maybe individual, because you get to know your unsaid. I didn't say this or that because of that. Maybe you keep it with you, but then it's already, it enacts, or it becomes real. So for me, it's a distinction between the unsaid known, and which is more a relational, intersubjective construct, and the unsaid, which really is one person's individual thoughts, which he's conscious or she conscious of, which you also can explain and verbalize. And of course, sometimes you need the help of someone to verbalize it. So sometimes you need someone to, then it becomes another relational construct, you could say. So it's yeah.
So conceptually, I think,
yes,
reading the whole research, there is room for improvement just conceptually. Yeah? So it's because if the unsaid is, let's say, is what you have seen, what you have observed during a board meeting, then after the board meeting, there is a conversation with you. You have the conversation, then the unsaid is relationally expressed to you. So is the unsaid, the ontological status of the unsaid, is it present in the first place, or is it only present because you are the interviewer, you are the conversation partner, and you, let's say, in the relation, the unsaid emerges because of the relation that the board member has with you?
I agree that this could be more specific, because I think sometimes people did not need my help, I would say that way, to verbalize their unsaid. They came in, they already had their stories ready. It was not even the outcome of the reflexive questions, because they already had the unsaid, was already older than this whole process, but at other times it was not. So I think I should be more clear, or can be more clear.
And this relates to my second question,
yes.
And probably there's no time enough to answer that fully, but just think about this question in the future. How are the two positions that you take in the conversation, the position as a researcher and the position as a consultant, how do these two positions relate to one another in relation to the board member in terms of creating trust and safety? And think about this, because this is also not clear in your research. Is it the researcher that creates a safe atmosphere, thanks to which the board member is opening up and sharing what he or she did not dare to say during the meeting? Or is it because of your consultancy skills? Think about this in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a good suggestion. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Michiel Ehrenhardt continues the discussion. He's Associate Professor of Strategic Entrepreneurship at the University of Twente. Dr. Ehrenhardt, we appreciate your willingness to participate in the discussion electronically, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. First of all, my compliments, of course, for the great work that you did. I myself, quite some time ago, studied the management team, followed the management team, and actually quite a lot of things were unsaid. So in that sense, it's a very interesting study to specifically reflect on this topic. But let's especially focus on what you did instead of what I did quite some time ago. So on the authority of Director Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I would like to ask you two questions that are related. First of all, you mentioned in your chapter 5 on page 157 that some of your respondents strongly disagreed with the presence of the unsaid. And they would actually share remarks that were inconsistent with their opinion. And in these instances, you would not be able to explore their strong opinion. And you already mentioned a bit in relation to this in regards to the first question that was asked today, but I would really like to hear from you how that exactly, how do you exactly know when you know what they are thinking, and Yeah, so especially for these strong opinionated members, what does this mean for the findings that you have? And then linking that to the more practical side. So what are the practical limitations? How will you convince these people in future that you actually have a valid point and that they maybe should have less strong opinions on this topic?
Learned opponent. Thank you for kind words. And your question, which concerns chapter 5, where I say that some board members said that they said everything. Is that basically your question? And how could I convince them that it's not true? Well, first, my response would be I would not like to convince them. If they think it's not, they say everything, then I always assumed then you're correct, because who am I to judge whether you say everything or not? Where it became inconsistent, for example, it was during the interview that they would express feelings that they were having during the meeting, which I observed they did not share. So then I would probe them, like, am I correct that you have not expressed these thoughts and feelings you express now with me? So how do you link those two expressions? So that was how I tried to probe them. But if they would still consider I say everything, I have encountered one of those board members who consistently said, I say all, and I couldn't probe them because I didn't see otherwise. Then one interview lasted really very shortly because it was okay. I mean, then it stops. And I had a very deep confidence that I didn't need more because maybe, you know, I had a lot of boards, I had a lot of interviews, a lot of data. So in one board, they all said we say everything. So it was very, very consistent. So that's why I worked with that. What does it mean that, you know, they all say everything? I inquired to what do you think helps you all say everything? So then I worked with that. So it was not that I always tried to explore, you know, it must be true. There must be something unsaid. That was not how I entered these interviews.
Thank you for your response, but I would like to probe a bit into that myself.
Yes.
You do say it's one of the fears that you have in that part. So could you perhaps still elaborate a bit more on what then would be the cause of this fear?
Could you, first sentence, because I didn't hear correctly, the first sentence you started off with?
But I would like to probe a bit more into your answer, which would be that you put it yourself as a fear into your chapter, that you have a fear that people still don't share everything. So is this fear then present, or is it, as you stated now, not present, and you would only not follow up with those that would say everything?
So you're asking if I sense that they were having fear that they didn't express it to me, is that what you're asking? I'm not so sure.
Well, to make it maybe a bit more simple, is that going to the practical implications of your work,
yeah.
Why do you mention it as a fear? If you say that those that say that they do not have unsaid topics, why is that then still a fear mentioned in your methodological reflection?
Oh, that's something I have to look into, because that's something that doesn't resonate for now. That if they feel everything is said, then they don't fear anything. Then they feel the cohesiveness in the board. They feel time to express things. They have a big sense of, when I'm not able to express it now, I will be expressing it later formally, and everybody will know about it. So some boards I did not encounter any fear.
Okay, then maybe we can move to the second part, the practical implications. As was mentioned by the previous opponent, you have a lot of experience, especially in the sector. But nonetheless, I only see half a page of practical implications of your study. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on the main practical implications of the study that you did?
The practical implications, I think it's interesting to see that the conventions and the rules very much shape what is said and not said. So a lot of the unsaid also relates to thoughts like, this is how we should do things. I should not express my thoughts and feelings now because it's not the right time. And I think reflexivity in that sense would help the board members to be conscious that if you do not express what you're thinking and feeling in the moment, it's often still expressed. Non-verbally, people sense what is not being said. So it's a risk there, so that you might be interpreting things incorrectly. And if you don't see each other every week, you cannot also refute things because you only see each other next time. And if you feel also inhibited by calling the chair because you don't want to make a fuss about it, then it remains in your head and it will shape the next time how you will respond next time. So one of the implications I would say is be more conscious about the unsaid and how it might shape the dialogue in the board meetings, and also maybe develop techniques that help you take some more time to listen to what is not being said with each other. So not that it's an individual thing that people should be doing, but it's a collective effort. So they should develop techniques, I would say, collectively to have more time for these types of processes.
The opponent seems to be satisfied with your answer.
Thank you.
Then I would like to invite Professor Jaap Winter to continue the discussion. He is Professor of Corporate Governance, Corporate Law and Behavior at this university, as well as Professor of International Corporate Law at our sister university here in Amsterdam, and former chair of the board of this university. So, Professor Winter, welcome back, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and great to be back, and particularly on this occasion of the ceremony of your defense of your thesis. I've read the thesis with great pleasure. It's fascinating. It's a subject that forces us to think about what's going on in boardrooms that we actually do not know, and then as a first to take what is actually not known there and is not said there is putting yourself at a very high bar of challenge, and I can only applaud you for doing so. The access to boards that you have been given, by the way, has been unprecedented. Not many researchers are able to observe so many boards with this type of questioning, and it has given you a wealth of information to explore, and it's great. The concept of board that you use in your thesis is very generic, performing control and service tasks, as you call it, and you based it on a paper of Forbes and Millikan of 2008. In reality, the roles of boards and within them the roles of non-executives in their interaction with executives is much more complex. It's diverse, it's granular. And I was surprised to see that you do not refer to the publication of one of your learned co-promoter on Board on Task, Understanding Board Performance of 2013, in which a much more granular elaboration of different tasks of the board and therefore interaction of non-executives and executives was explored, requiring different cognitive and behavioral skills and levels of intensity of that interaction. Also, boards and how they operate in real practice differ much depending on their context. There are different types of boards, one-tier and two-tier boards. Boards without any executives exist. Boards with employee co-determined members, boards without them. Boards of listed companies with anonymous shareholders have another reality to deal with than boards of family-owned businesses. Their task is simply different. Boards of building societies, which predominantly are foundations, have no principals which have a stake in the governance, while companies who have shareholders have a role in the governance themselves. None of these complexities, variations, and differences are explained in your thesis. In chapter 3 on paradigm attachment, you then investigate how the unsaid operates in the board, looking at these paradigm attachments. But these paradigm attachments are very much affected by these complexities and variations, but you do not explore this. Now, you've shown in your thesis, and it has already been discussed, an admirable level of awareness of how also a researcher's own biases can influence the outcomes of her research, if only because the questions she raises and does not raise, and how she interprets answers to those questions. So on the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, my question to you is this. Have you not taken a too generic approach to boards? And has your concept of boards, that generic concept of boards, not influenced your findings, for example, on paradigm attachment and the conclusions you draw from them? And to make that more specific, to what extent can your findings on paradigm attachment be transplanted to a one-tier board environment in a listed company?
Learned opponent, thank you for your kind words and your question, which relates to actually methodology and linking it to, no, not only methodology, but also how do I see boards and how do I link my findings to the various boards. And we've got a lot of structures which of course shape the decision making. So the structure of the board shapes the decision making. And how do I deal with that? And to what extent is are my findings, how can I generate theories or generalize from it? When I started this whole PhD, I didn't know much about boards. I have been a consultant, but I didn't know anything about board of directors. And I liked that stance. I consciously did not take a course because I thought I have to ask silly questions. And so when I started the first board meeting, I was already surprised to see the CEO present in a board meeting. I was like, this is a board of directors. What does the CEO do here? So I had all these questions. So but I started entering boards after I conceptualized, based on literature, what I think how the onset shapes decision-making in a boardroom. That is very generic. Then you based your literature on Forbes and Millikan, for example. And when I started entering boards, of course, I'm very dependent on the data I got. So the biggest data set comes from the housing corporations. They have a two-tier governance structure. So the paradigms I'm referring at is mostly confined to this sector. And so then I'm also referring to the code of this sector, the conventions of this sector, their language, which is very similar. I did explore 2 other boards, and I find it intriguing to see similar patterns that also occurred there. But I cannot generalize from the data that applies. I cannot say, okay, this happens in the housing corporation sector, so there must be also a compliance culture in the financial sector. I cannot say that. So in that sense, you cannot generalize. And if you look from my ontological and epistemological stance, I would also be careful to generalize based on my theories, because I don't, from my ontology perspective, it's very scary to generalize at all. We should always be careful, because every board can be different. So in that sense, I would be asking everybody to be cautious when you read my thesis, to use the findings more like a dialogical model, dialogical theories that can help us start a conversation about the onset in the boardroom and how it might shape them. But I would not say, okay, this applies to every board in every sector. Regarding the 1 tier, I think it's interesting that if you look at the behaviors in action, that also 2-tier boards sometimes behave like 1 tier, in the sense that they never have deliberation time only by themselves. So in a way, they almost behave like the 1-tier board. So how do we define boards if you look at their actual in-use behavior? That would also something that intrigues me. So I would very much like to explore 1-tier boards and see how decision making unfolds.
But in your answer, you already show that you have a paradigm about a 1-tier board and a 2-tier board.
Of course.
Which influences what you think you observe.
Yes.
But you do not, but that's my question, that's the other part of my question. You do not explain in your thesis how your paradigms have influenced what you have observed. And you started out saying it by, actually, I had no paradigm, but you developed one very quickly. And how did that influence the way that you've structured your observations and the conclusions you draw from them?
One of the rules that I had in my mind is when people respond differently than I expect from a paradigm that I have at that moment in time, then if I verbalize my confusion, then they are able to refute me. So that was my rule of the game. So I think that I developed a paradigm, but every time my paradigm seemed conflicting with people I was interviewing, then I explored that. Still, I'm not so sure. I must be paradigm attached myself. I mean, we are all. I mean, that's basically what I've tried to say. And the only thing we can do is when things happen that you do not expect, that then you start reflecting. So.
Thank you for that. And if I have a little bit time for a second.
A very brief question.
But then a very brief question on the silence climates that you describe in chapter 4 of your thesis. You describe 4 silence climates with some certainty and some, if I may call it, black and whitish framing of what they are. And I wonder, and to make it very brief, whether you've imagined these silent climates to exist and then started to explore whether your observations confirmed they existed or whether they came to your mind when you were observing. What was first, your observation or your thoughts about what sort of climates you actually were witnessing? And in addition, did you really observe these climates as black and white as you described them?
Thank you. To be brief, no, this black and white is more like I said, a dialogical model that helps board members to understand what I try to convey, because it's, of course, it's dynamic, and as I try to explain, it very quickly can change and go back, and also some board members have topics that they feel really well and everything is exchanged, and some topics then suddenly there's a silence climate, and of course that shapes what happens next. So it's far more nuanced, but I tried to develop this model, and to answer the second question, I developed the model after I had gathered the data, and I was struggling to actually try to explain what I found based on, and this is iterating between back and forth, the data and the theories. So I developed this theory around silence climates after I had gathered the data and tried to see how I can contribute to literature based on what I found.
This will do.
Thank you.
The last opponent is Professor Frans Rosen, Professor of Management Accounting at our School of Business and Economics. Professor Rosen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. On the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I would like to first compliment you with the thought-provoking and substantive study that you performed. I really appreciated reading the outcomes of your study and your contribution to this topic. I would like to focus on chapter 3, where you discuss how governance paradigm attachment enacts a spiral of the unsaid. And upon reading that, I thought back of an earlier study that I did, where we found that interactions between multiple actors, and you could see a board as an interaction of multiple actors, both human and non-human, initiate a process in which the non-human actor enacted, so governance paradigm enacted, but was also enacted upon by the other actors in the network, and thus interactively generating unpredictable effects and shaping the network in unexpected ways. Now, this non-human actor in that other study was control. And you yourself state that one of the tasks of boards is performing control. So you could say that control is a more concrete specification of governance paradigm. And even more, we found that in organizations, multiple overlapping and interfering controls come into being. And this seems to resemble the governance paradigm's similarities and differences that you found in boards. Thus, one can envision board members as a network of multiple actors, and the governance paradigm can be envisioned as the non-human actor in this network of associations. Now, the non-human actor that, and I quote chapter 3 of your dissertation, enacts a spiral of the unsaid. So, as I read it that way, your dissertation actually seems to think of a sort of one-way direction. It's only enacting, and thus of a somewhat stable nature, shaping decision-making. Whereas we found that control is also enacted upon by the other actors in the network. So it came to be a different thing in different situations. Now, following this reasoning, I have a couple of questions. The first one is, could it be the case that the governance paradigm not only enacts, but is also enacted upon? And could that imply that decision-making in boards, that is the network of associations of which the governance paradigm is part, is dynamic and subject to change? And if that is the case, what does that mean for the outcomes of your study?
Learned opponent, thank you for your words, and difficult question. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that a paradigm enacts and is not enacted upon. and which you found in a different study was differently, because that was more like a process instead of a linear outcome. The way I see it is, depending on whether there is a paradigm attachment, it becomes fixed. So I will try to explain it in a concrete way. A chair who's paradigm attached and who perceives a board member not behaving according to his paradigm, and he tries to change the behavior of this non-executive, and this non-executive does not respond well, and therefore they decide collectively that this non-executive should leave the board when the term expires, then the paradigm remains the same and there's no learning taking place. However, when the chair is not paradigm attached, and he speaks with his non-executive, and there's a learning process, because then the non-executive responds and explains why he responded in a way, and also maybe they discuss about the way the chair responds to him and so on. So it's not only about the topic, but also about how they interrelate. Then they learn, and then it's enacted upon, then it changes. But I think the paradigm attachment is the thing that explain how things remain similar, or that it really changes the process, how it unfolds.
So actually, you say there is not only a one-way street. The governance paradigm enacts the unset, and the unset shapes decision-making. But you said when there's learning, there's also the governance paradigm is enacted upon. But if I understand you correctly, could that mean that you can turn the title of your manuscript around? So the title now is How the Unset Shapes Decision-Making in Boards. Governance paradigm enacts the unset, and the unset shapes decision-making in boards. Could it be the case that decision-making in boards actually shapes the unset and thereby is enacting upon governance paradigms?
I would agree with that. If you look at my conceptual model in chapter 3, where I say the stakeholders also influence with the unsaid known what goes on in the boardroom, and what goes on in the boardroom, their decision making enacts what stakeholders think and feel, there is this link. So for example, when things go wrong in the boardroom, then we have these authorities that may step in. So the decisions of the boardroom might enact the behavior of the external parties, who then develop rules, which then shapes the process within the boardroom. So then this is a loop. Should I elaborate a bit on that?
Please continue till the beetle interferes.
So the interesting thing is that we are developing more and more rules, it seems, about what goes on, what should be going on in the boardroom. And the question is, how do these rules also shape the paradigms in the boardroom, and therefore the decision making, and how this interrelated ecosystem actually shapes what goes on in the boardroom. So what goes on in the boardroom is not just a result of these board members and the unsaid that emerges between them, but also what the effects of the unsaid on the authorities, and how the authorities behave towards these boards. Now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the doctoral examination committee in the School of Business and Economics, which will decide whether the degree of Doctor of Philosophy will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn this meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the School of Business and Economics for further deliberations.
Zo.
Please be seated. Gaat u zitten. I hereby reopen this public meeting. By its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the School of Business and Economics has decided to grant the degree Doctor of Philosophy to Marilieke Engbers. Professor Kapova, who has been appointed as one of the supervisors by the College of Deans, will now perform the investiture. I invite both supervisors, Professor Kapova and Van der Loo, to sign the degree certificate as witness of this deed. Meanwhile, I declare in public that in the privacy of the closed session, the candidate, by her signature, stated her adherence to the conditions laid down in the provisions in Article 6 of the doctoral regulations of this university regarding rights and responsibilities in society and science. May I now request Professor Kapova to resume the ceremony. During the pronouncement of the investiture formula, only the members of the Doctoral Examination Committee here at the table and in the side benches stand.
By the virtue of the authority vested in me and by the statute of the Vrije Universiteit and as supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on you, Marilieke Engbers, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of university and signatures of the rector and the supervisors has been affixed to the diploma you are about to receive. Yeah. Dear Marilieke, dear Dr. Engbers, I'm very excited that I can be the first to call you doctor and to congratulate you, and also on behalf of your co-promoter, Eric Van der Loo. I would like to instead congratulations to the family and to friends, everyone who is here today, but also who is watching you virtually. I think there are many fans attending the ceremony virtually. I know that PhD is not an easy task, to write PhD, to do research and to be resident for something like 4 years, sometimes even longer in lives of persons. But in your case, it's not the only hard work that brought you here, but it's also your personality. And let me talk a bit on that. So Eric actually often speaks about you, nicely of course, and then he calls you powerhouse. I looked in the dictionary, so, you know, powerhouse sounds good, but what is the powerhouse? So powerhouse, according to the dictionary, is a person of great energy, strength, and power. And I would like to add to that, that it's also a person with incredible drive and the person who dares. And it is the daring that brought you here. And if you think of that, just take a look at a few examples of your PhD trajectory. First of all, who would dare to study the topic that you cannot actually touch and see? It is the unsaid, right? And also, it takes some guts to get access to very closed communities, societies such as boards. And of course, it is only the daring person who would even develop her own methodology. This is truly impressive, and congratulations with that. There's one thing that I've personally learned from you during the 4 years, is that unsaid is not only about not speaking, it's also about not hearing. And much of what is around us here, we refuse to see sometimes. I think in finances, there's even a term of ostrich behavior when putting, as a bird, you put your head deep in the sand. And I think that also what happens to investors very often. But in your case, you've been always hearing us and also hearing people working with you, studying with you, and your family. And it is them and us that I would like to speak on behalf. We are very grateful for your all contributions to the PhD program, for being a great colleague, and even to being a little bit of an academic sister to me and to Lara. Thank you for everything, and I think you will be still surprising us. And of course, in the first place, please do surprise yourself with all the inventions and creativity that you have. Congratulations, enjoy this degree. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Engbers, on behalf of the College of Dean, I also would like to congratulate you with the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. My congratulations are also directed towards your family and the ones who are close to you. You did a wonderful job by delivering a solid piece of theoretical and empirical work on a better understanding of decision-making processes in boardrooms, with a focus on the unsaid. In my opinion, theoretically complicated and challenging, empirically cumbersome with all these interviews and meetings. Your study provides new insights together with lessons learned. I hope that your work will prove to be useful for further research. You can be proud of your academic achievement, and I wish you every success in your future career. Ladies and gentlemen, please leave this hall in a row-by-row order and consider 1.5 meter distance. Given the government rules, there is unfortunately no reception in this main building, but in the basket outside this building on the campus. Please be so kind to leave this building as soon as possible. Dames en heren, opdat ik deze openbare vergadering van de promotiecommissie van de School of Business and Economics kan sluiten met het uitspreken van de lofverheffing, verzoek ik u allen op te staan. Please rise. De naam des Heren zij geprezen van nu aan tot in eeuwigheid.